Welcome back to Parenting Porcupines. I'm Kasie Whitener, and with me, my good friend Jessica Etheridge. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
So this is episode 5, and we called it Applesauce and Anarchy. And I think it's because as libertarians, we have a tendency to be okay with a small amount, maybe a bigger amount of anarchy. And so we're going to talk today about the Portland protests, and specifically the federal government sending troops into Portland to protect federal property. And I'm trying to introduce that in a way that does not give away how unbelievably outraged I am by this behavior. So what is Parenting Porcupines? Well, we're libertarian moms, and we are taking it upon ourselves to educate other moms and honestly, anybody who wants to watch what libertarian ideals really are, and what does it mean to be a libertarian, and really what does it mean to raise your kids as libertarians. And so we're going to take today's topic with the approach of how did we talk to our kids about this? Because I know you're talking to Jackson about this, and I was talking to Holly about it. Both of us have middle schoolers. My daughter's going into 7th grade. And I just don't understand why people are not outraged by what was going on in Portland. I just don't get it. And so after our episode that we recorded last night, you and I spent a good bit of time ranting about this. And all we had to do was frame it for, okay, what does it mean in terms of parenting? And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So Jessica lives in the upstate. As I mentioned, you have a son who's going into 6th grade, right?
Yep. And one in elementary school.
And did you talk to him about what was happening in Portland? I mean, was there a conversation about that since we talked about it last night?
We haven't talked as much about Portland specifically, but we have talked about the protests in general and what's going on. Why are people protesting? Kind of what is their goal, and the difference between the people who are there to protest for a purpose, mm-hmm. and then the people who are there as kind of opportunists and they just want to, loot Target because there's a difference. But yeah, so I mean, we've had conversations about what's going on and why, and then the good side and the bad side and all of that. So.
Yeah, so after you and I finished talking last night, I was still pretty fired up, and I went into the other room and I was talking to my husband about it, and I was saying I just didn't understand why people are not completely outraged that the federal government has put troops in Portland. It feels like an extraordinary overreach of power, and it is entirely about politically motivated behavior, which means it is this administration using federal forces to quell a particular voice that's coming out of Portland. It's not all voices coming out of wherever. It's about a particular voice, and it's a photo op, right? If they can demonstrate, and by they, I mean the Justice Department, if they can make it look like Black Lives Matter protesters are violent and they are attacking our country, then they can make those same protesters look like they're destroying our country. And that photo op with the federal agents swooping in to save the poor citizens of Portland was what they were going for.
But instead, what they actually did was they swooped in and threw people in vans and took them to undisclosed locations without due process. So,
egregious violations of individual rights. I mean, just egregious violations, right? And in every single circumstance and every single story that came out of Portland was that people were in Portland. People did not want those federal troops there. The mayor didn't want them there. The citizens didn't want them there. People did not believe it was necessary. And so the discussion that Charlie and I were having last night, the very heated discussion, was about the destruction of property. And this is the line I want to talk about, because to me, as we're talking about riots being the language of the unheard, right? Riots occur because people want change, and change is not coming. And riots are going to get violent. Riots are going to have destructive elements to them. And on my part, I think, okay, if we're protecting individuals, if we're protecting human life, I understand the role of peace officers, right? In Columbia, South Carolina, back in May, we had some riots happening after a Black Lives Matter protest. It wasn't the Black Lives Matter protesters, it was some sort of hangers-on that were rioting. And the Columbia police set up a perimeter, to protect individuals, right? To secure individual safety, but they were not intervening. They were not approaching or aggressive toward the rioters. They were letting the riots play out, right? Because when property gets damaged, property can be replaced.
Right.
Cars can be replaced, buildings can be replaced, trees can be replaced. Human beings cannot. So, okay, send some folks in there. Let's have some security to protect individual people. But property, man,
Yeah.
it's just property.
It was funny because last night, and I think what prompted this conversation, and it's funny because we just recorded the episode about the non-aggression principle, so now we're talking about violent protests, but I think that what sparked this whole conversation last night and why we decided to do it tonight, because it's such an important topic. I mean, when we're talking about our rights and our liberties, these things are very important, and we should be discussing them amongst ourselves, but also with our children. But what prompted this discussion was I saw someone on my Facebook feed had posted a tweet that they saw from ABC News, and it said something about a protest turning violent, and the protesters had wrecked a courthouse and set a police station on fire, I think. But the person asked the question, what do you consider a violent protest? And I said to my husband, and he always just rolls his eyes at me because he gets really sick of hearing me be anarchist. But I said, I mean, like, what is he looking for? Like, on a scale of Boston Tea Party to American Revolution, because was that whole time not one big violent protest? Was the American Revolution not like the ultimate demonstration of protest? So, yeah.
No, I think you're exactly right, because you gave that exact spectrum. Like, what are we talking about here? What are we looking at? And what I said to you was I could see if protesters were marching on Google, and it's Google's private property, and Google has every right to call in some kind of security force to protect their private property. And so individual homes, I would absolutely say I would want my individual home to be protected. And that's what Charlie asked to. If we lived downtown Columbia and this was happening downtown Columbia, if, you know, how would you feel if our house was vandalized? And I told him, I said, honestly, if we are safe, if you and I and Holly as individuals are safe, I'm going to hate it, but we have insurance for that. Right? We have insurance to protect our property from damage, from ruin, and we'll rebuild, because buildings get rebuilt. That's how property works, right? Like, they're not stealing our property from us, but they might in fact damage or destroy our property. And so anyway, so we're talking about how do you talk to your kids about this. So Charlie and I are in this heated debate last night, and after a little while we kind of quiet down a little bit, and Holly sort of pokes her head out and she comes down and sits down on the couch, and we're kind of done with this conversation by that point, so we don't say anything about it last night. Today, riding in the car, Holly says to me, what happened in Portland? She said, I heard you and Dad were really, you know, kind of heated about this last night. And so I started trying to explain it to her, and she said, it's Portland. And I said, yeah. And I said, and it's federal property. It was a federal judicial building. And so the judicial department, the judiciary sent the troops. And she goes, but it's Portland. Why don't the people in Portland do something about Portland? And I was like, exactly. That's exactly what my position is, was that the people in Portland were trying to do something about Portland. We saw the moms staying out late to midnight, right? We saw some viral video of single moms saying, I'm here because this is my town and we don't want you here. At that point, she was addressing the federal troops. She was saying to the federal troops, we do not want you here. That, if that call is not being heeded, if they're staying anyway, we're in some serious trouble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was watching a video last night. Caldwell woke me up in the middle of the night, and so I was scrolling on Facebook, and this guy posted a video to the Muddied Waters media page. He was actually in Portland, and he was covering, I think he's like an independent reporter. He's got his own page. I can't remember the guy's name.
We'll find it. We'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah. But he was he was just filming and he was saying what's going on. Like, it was very objective. It was not biased. It was just, this is what's happening. I've been out here for 3 hours. This is what's been going on. And you could see the protesters who were still there. And he said that a lot of them had left, but they were all on the other side of the street. And apparently what had happened was one person tried to scale the fence because they had like this concrete barricade all the way around the law enforcement center. I guess is what I equate it to. They had like this concrete barricade, and then it had a fence on top. And somebody tried to scale the fence. Well, in response to that, they started shooting pepper balls, throwing gas canisters out at the protesters, like all of the protesters, because of one person. And so he was talking about that. And I mean, while he was on this live video, he got hit with a pepper ball. And he's like, I'm just standing here covering this. And I mean, he was pretty far away. So I think when we talk about these types of situations with our kids, or when I talk about these types of situations with our kids, the point that I make is that just because you have a badge and a gun does not make you above the law, right? Like, you have a responsibility, and even more so because you're in a position of power, which is one of the things that we talked about last night. When you're in a position of power, you can't be that bully. When one person does something and an entire police force comes out of a building and they're behind a fence and they are shielded with shields and they've got helmets and body armor, and they are shooting objects at human beings who are not climbing the fence. One person on one side of the building, and they're all around the building shooting things at people. That's not okay. Right? Like, that is not okay, because most of these people are not doing anything wrong. They're just chanting, dancing, holding signs, whatever it may be. And, you know, I think my kids understand that distinction between that being okay and not okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the question is about, where is the aggression initiated? Right? Is the aggression being initiated by the protesters, or is the aggression being initiated by the heavily armed police? And when we think of heavily armed masked police, we have to remember that if they are to initiate aggression, or even if aggression is occurring against them, they're in a better condition to accept that aggression, right? Because they are armed, right? They are in fact shielded from that. And so you make a good point about, if they're behind this fence and the people that they are lobbing these pepper balls at are on the other side that are not being aggressive, who initiated the aggression? And before we even get to that, the question I have more than anything else is, at what point does a person scaling a fence pose a threat to an entire armed military force, right?
Yeah.
At what point does somebody go, that guy's climbing the fence, and somebody else just goes, let him fall, right? Like, he's going to get to the top and not know what to do and probably fall down and go splat, right? Like, this is not going to work out well for the guy on the fence. But that doesn't mean we then need to initiate aggression in response to it. And I just think we're so far past this place of rational thought as far as this kind of thing is concerned, which is why I said I don't think that this was a measured response to specific threats. I think it's a political stunt. And I think that those federal officers are there intentionally to make it look like the protesters are violent, protesters are tearing apart our city, that the division in our country is coming from these protesters, and that the federal law enforcement needs to have a presence to be able to quell violence. And none of those things are true. None of those things are true. But that's the image that was captured and broadcast. And there are people in both of our social media networks that believe that federal troops absolutely should go on site to protect federal property. And again, to my daughter's question, to Holly's question, number one, Mom, it's Portland. So shouldn't Portland take care of Portland? Mm-hmm. And number two, if it's federal property, it's our property. We own it. We are the taxpayers. That is our property. And if we decide that we're going to vandalize it, my God, we'll do so, right? And it's not right, and we shouldn't do that. Like, as civilized people, we should not do that. But do we have the right to do it? Yes, we do. And I just don't understand how people are not completely outraged that our president sent the troops into a city and tried to, like, I'm just flabbergasted by it. I just can't understand why people aren't outraged by it.
Yeah. I have no words.
Let's do a whole show on this when I have no words other than lots and lots of swear words.
Well, I think that's it. Like, we take out all the cussing and we
and I lose the monologues from last night because I've taken out all my cuss words.
They were pretty epic.
I think when we go back to this concept of riots being a language, right? Riots are the voice of the unheard. Martin Luther King told us that. They're the voice of the unheard. Riots are a language that is saying, I'm not being heard. My demands are not being met. The injustice that I am protesting against is not changing. I don't see change. And that needs to be addressed with language that promises change, with actual demonstrable change. And if instead it's met with more violence, more police brutality, that's the complete wrong response to this. The complete wrong response.
If our children are watching these events unfold, because there are plenty of videos, of live feeds where peaceful protests, there are people who are peacefully protesting, and the aggression is not instigated by them. It is not started by them. It's the federal troops or the law enforcement. I mean, you see things like in New York with the older gentleman who approached some officers and they tossed him down to the ground, and he busted his head open. Several officers walked by. Like, I don't care what that man said or what they thought he was going to do. Obviously, he wasn't enough of a threat for them to detain him. So what was the point of pushing this 70-something-year-old man to the ground? And why did so many officers walk by him, seeing him laying on the ground bleeding without doing anything to help him? What is that doing for the image to help in these situations when there's not that give and take, I guess?
Well, it's a callousness, right? I mean, it's just this callousness of armed officers who have I mean, I can't even speak from their perspective. They may feel threatened. I don't know, other than to say we have seen these individuals in multiple circumstances demonstrate a callousness and a disregard for the rights of peaceful protesters. And I think my frustration with the position that it's because it's federal property, it's okay to send federal troops. I fully believe that property is in Oregon, it's in Portland, and there's an escalation that needs to occur, right? It starts with our community coming out and speaking to other members of the community and saying, hey, this isn't what we're about, right? So let's go back to like the protesters fired fireworks, or they were tossing Molotov cocktails at the courthouse. So let's start with the community coming out and saying, this is not who we are. We're not going to behave this way, right? We're not going to set things on fire. We're not going to, but I mean, my God, in Kentucky, after they won the national championship in basketball, they were burning couches, right? Like, riots and destruction of property is not new. You know what I mean? Like, even the campus police didn't show up to get in the way of that craziness. You know what I mean? Like, this is not, people destroying property is not a new thing. So why Portland? Why now? And why a Black Lives Protest march, right? Like, why that specific group? And that's what I'm saying. I believe it's politically motivated. And when we watch an administration use the resources of the federal government to create a political statement, we're edging toward dictatorship.
And it's not, I mean, it's not just a statement. This is not just a statement that they made. They blatantly violated the rights of people of America. It's not okay.
No.
It's not okay. And I want to be very clear, because it's when we're having these conversations, people are going to watch this, and some people are going to say, well, you hate all police, and you're a cop hater or whatever. And that's not true. That's not true. One of the things that I told Kasie last night, I have a lot of friends who have worn a badge. Some of them still do wear a badge. They are some of the most amazing people that I know. They care about their community. They care about other people, and they would never hurt another person. And they are the kind of cops that if they were in a situation where they saw another cop doing to George Floyd what that cop did, I don't remember his name. Even if I did, I probably wouldn't say it because I don't think he deserves to be publicized in any way. But I think they would have stepped in and stopped it. Like, I think that they are those good cops, but I think that these types of situations also bring out the bad. And I think that's kind of what we need to keep in mind when we talk about these protests too, because that's part of why these protests are happening, right? It's because of these things that are happening by these militarized police forces.
Right. Well, and so to Charlie's point, as he was asking me about this last night, he said, well, do you think it's okay that Antifa is happening, is getting into these protests and this kind of thing? So let's be very clear. The words anti-fascist, which is where Antifa comes from, right? We should all be anti-fascists, okay? They lost World War II in Italy, okay? Like, they're not good people, fascists, right? So to be anti-fascist with lowercase a and f, right? That's okay. In the concept of Antifa, right? I don't believe that, and this is probably where we're gonna get a ton of comments and people being like, what? To me, Antifa is like Al-Qaeda. It was this loose network of disgruntled militants, right? Mm-hmm. And we named it and we strengthened it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is happening with this loose network of militants that are opposed to law and order, that are opposed to peaceful protest, right? And so when those elements come out and they associate themselves with Al-Qaeda, right? They gain power. When they come out and associate themselves with Antifa, they gain power. They gain notoriety. We don't even need to mess with that. We're talking about individuals. We're talking about a handful, a small percentage of the actual protesters. Don't even give them the power, right? Don't call them anything. Don't pay any attention to them. And sure as hell, don't use them as an excuse to occupy Portland. Like, you sent federal troops into a sovereign city, a city that has its own levels of government, right? A city that where the mayor said, we do not want you here. And they did it anyway. They went anyway. I mean, it's just this gross overreach of power, and it is a complete and total abuse of the federal system. And it's just evidence upon, what we've had so far, decades of evidence that the federal government is just too big. They do too much. They're in too many places, and they believe that we won't fight back, and we can't, right? Portland is showing that it took a turn in social media. It took people saying, get out of Portland, right? It took people saying, this ain't right. You can't do that, for them to leave, because they're heavily armed and we're not.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. We were watching Hamilton yesterday.
No, not you guys.
For the 900th time. And when I think about the things that pushed our revolutionaries to revolution, it's these kinds of injustices. It's these kinds of overreach of power. And somebody has to stand up and say, it's not okay. And we're not going to put up with it. Which I think partly may be where the conversation with Holly comes in too, because she understands the nuance of the revolution, because we watch so much Hamilton, and because we talk about King George and the violations and taxation without representation and all these kinds of things and we talk about Hamilton's specific phrases that he uses, saying we have to revolt, we have to do something about this. And I think we're not headed toward another revolution. We don't need a revolution in this country. We have the mechanisms to fix this, but we have to be able to exercise those mechanisms. And right now,
well, and I think people have to be willing to do it, and that's another thing that we talk a lot about in our house when we talk about these types of situations with the protests and when they get violent. Obviously, we teach our children non-aggression principle, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. That also means that you don't tear things up. You don't
Right.
damage other people's property.
Right.
But we do talk about why it's happening, and making sure that our kids know that even though we don't necessarily agree with the destruction of property, whichever property it may be, we do support protesters' rights to protest, and that it's not a bad thing to stand up for what you believe in. And it's not a bad thing. It's not only about your rights, it's all the rights for all the people.
Right.
And if you're standing up for someone else's rights, those are your rights too. So, we're all in this together. And the fact that it drives me nuts, the fact that people don't get that. Like, you said we have the mechanisms in place to fix this, but nobody wants to.
Well, aren't they complacent, right? Don't they believe that if their lives are okay, if things are working okay for them, they have a house, they have a job, things are okay for them. And what we've seen this summer is that it's not true. People are losing their houses. They're losing their jobs. They're losing their businesses. Black lives, people are losing their lives to police violence, right? What we've seen this summer is that things are not okay. All those folks that are out there being complacent about, well, things in my life are just fine. I can let the two parties continue to do their thing, let government continue to roll all over everybody else. That can't be. It just can't be. We're seeing more and more people for whom things are not okay. And the only way to get change is to actually enact real change. And it's going to be scary and it's going to be painful, but it's got to happen.
Yeah.
It's got to happen. We can't go back to the way things used to be.
Well, maybe our kids are going to do it.
Maybe our kids are going to do it. I can't wait that long. Poor little Holly. She's 12. She's got time. She's still got to go to school and do what she needs to do. This has been Parenting Porcupines. We're going to talk, I think, in a future episode about how painful change really can be, and some of these opportunities that we're being given because of what's happened this summer to change how we've always looked at a ton of different things. As what Holly and I talked about today, Jessica, I cannot wait for you and I to go off on this, was how we've always done education a certain way, but now we have the opportunity to do it differently. And do we have the courage to really make that change? And so that's what I think probably our next episode is going to be about. It's always good to see you, Jessica.
Yeah, you too.
All right, y'all follow us, like the video, share the video, subscribe to the rest of the videos. We've been Parenting Porcupines. We missed Melissa. We missed Alex this week, but we'll get them back here sometime soon. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being part of it.
Bye everybody.